Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, and we're in Dearborn, Michigan at the Labor Notes Conference. Now joining us is Dan Botz. He's the editor of Mexican Labor News and Analysis. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
So something just under 30 years ago, neoliberalist reforms came to Mexico, IMF and such, and we were told it would usher in a new era of prosperity for Mexico and increased productivity and better standards of living. So what happened?
Well, we've had in Mexico a series of economic problems since the beginning of that era that you mentioned back in the 1980s. Mexico has had several currency devaluations, several economic crises. Today, of course, Mexico is caught up in the general world economic crisis, and because it's so intimately linked with the United States, it suffers the same depression that the United States is currently suffering, high levels of unemployment and so on. And of course, we know throughout this whole period, about 10% of Mexicans have sought to live elsewhere because there wasn't enough work, good paying jobs in Mexico. Many have migrated to the United States. So the whole introduction of the neoliberal economic model, the NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement treaty, all of those things have led to a great deal of economic problems, difficulties for the Mexican people.
Now, if I understand it correctly, what we've seen over this period is a great increase in the concentration of ownership. Most of the major sectors of the Mexican economy are in quite a few hands. Talk about this process a bit.
Well, Mexico has been for hundreds of years one of the country's most unequal distribution of wealth, but that was made even worse with this neoliberal economic changes starting in the 80s, so that we have Carlos Slim, the richest man in Mexico, I think he's now the richest man in the world, or one of them, who concentrates not only the telecommunications industry, but many other industries in Mexico. You have this company, Grupo Mexico, which is a very powerful mining company. The news media are concentrated in the hands of a few big corporations, and something 10, 20, 30 big corporations dominate the Mexican economy. And the wealthy in Mexico are very, very wealthy, and the gap between them and the rest of the country is enormous.
So what's that meant for unions in Mexico?
Well, unions in Mexico were historically part of a kind of a state institutional system. And unions in Mexico have not been independent by and large since the Mexican Revolution that began in 1910 and ended, we could say, in 1940. So the unions were always kind of part of the state system, but the state had a nationalist economic model. And that economic model of developing the internal market, of nationalizing the country's natural resources, such as oil, of creating national industries such as railroad and telephone that were owned by the government, created a certain kind of economy which allowed workers to see for for a couple of decades, rising incomes and rising standard of living, called the Mexican Miracle back in the 1950s and 60s, though didn't mean that everybody prospered or that everyone did well. And the unions in Mexico were really part of the state system. They were part of the state party and part of the government. They didn't operate independently, and they didn't always do, in the nationalist period, they did not do a great job for workers. They were fundamentally there to carry out the state's economic policy.
But a somewhat nationalist policy.
It was a nationalist policy, but it was a nationalist policy for the nationalist for the national capitalist class. It was a nationalist economic development policy that primarily benefited the wealthy. But it was a national policy in which there was a decision made: we'll have to distribute wealth to other sectors of society, and workers will have to share in this to some extent. They did not share in it fully, and they did not share it as much as they might have, for sure.
And then in the 1980s, things start to change. So talk a little more in detail about that.
Well, in the 1980s, we could take, for example, the election of Carlos Salinas de Gortari, who was president of Mexico in that period from 1988 to 1994. Carlos Salinas comes in and basically decides to have a big auction and sell off the state's nationalized industries, sold off the railroad industry, sold off the telecommunications industry. That's where Carlos Slim, the billionaire, comes from.
Sold off meaning privatized.
Privatized them, sold off the state industries to private industry, and those private industries then had a very different attitude towards unions than the state had, and wanted to change the economic model of the unions. Also, the state closed some plants, closed some industries. There was a kind of a geographic reorganization of industry, partly having to do with the relationship to the United States, the growth of the maquiladora zone, the growth of about 100 or 200 miles south of the border of another economic zone there. So the model changed the situation for unions and
What
workers.
was the role of U.S. policy in the change?
The U.S. was promoting around the world. I mean, since Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher adopted the privatization model in the 1980s, they had pressured that to the rest of the world. It became known as the Washington Consensus, that the rest of the world would have to adopt open markets, free markets, private industry, sell off national industries, deregulate, and attack the labor movement and cut the social budget. So those items became the core policies of neoliberalism worldwide and in Mexico. So the United States was very supportive of this new neoliberal group, which was first in the old Institutional Revolutionary Party and later was in the National Action Party, sort of like the Republican Party of Mexico, and Vicente Fox became the first president in the year 2000 from a different party than the old revolutionary ruling party.
So the amount of emigration that takes place from Mexico, to what extent is that linked to these policies in this period?
Oh, it's absolutely linked. The changes in the Mexican economy, for example, the open up of the agricultural market, meaning that U.S. companies could dump corn, let's say, into Mexico, meant that corn farmers were facing a competition like they'd never faced before. They were not able to compete with the corn dumped from the United States. And at the same time, Mexico dropped its subsidies for corn and for this agriculture. So the two combined to wipe out many rural farmers. Some of those people first migrated to some city in Mexico, and when they don't find work there, they migrate to the border, maybe to look for jobs in the maquiladoras, and then they migrate to the United States. It's not always in several processes. They might go directly from some rural place in Oaxaca or Chiapas to come to work now someplace in the United States.
So what's been happening in the Mexican trade union movement to resist this and to try to improve the conditions there?
Well, Mexican labor unions first faced a terrible attack, and of course the labor unions, since they had been state labor unions with a very cozy relationship to the government, a cozy relationship to the ruling party, were not really prepared to fight. Most of the unions in Mexico were controlled by the government, but workers often fought back themselves. Rank and file workers, organizing movements, social movements organized between workers and communities, and the independent unions fought back. And at a certain point in the 1990s, the labor movement sort of cracked over this. The old official part of the labor movement having become very corrupt and violent and gangsterized, and a new, more independent union movement developed. The National Union of Workers, representing a number of unions that try to create a new model of unionism.
Well, in the next segment of our interview, let's talk about the new union movement and the strike struggles that are going on now.
Okay, great.
Please join us for the next segment of our interview with Dan Botz on the Real News Network.